the legend continues. My cardiologist says I can have some Count Chocula this month, as long as I take it easy. Un poquito, no mucho. And that's okay because I'm not trying to age into a general blob. But when spooky season comes around, there's one thing I gotta do. I don't eat much cereal these days. Not just because of the sugar, but because if you're a man or a woman with a beard, you know the struggle. However, I'm making an exception for my favorite monster here. And taking it easy won't be a problem because I'm gonna eat it with my middle fingers. Let's have some fun. As usual, we'll stuff this cavity with packing paper to save 9 cents of clay, and then use 10 cents of tape to hold everything in. Count Chocula is a pretty thin character, so I don't have much to build up. I'm starting with the neck because it's easier to access at this point. Then I'll start roughing in the shoulders and torso so I can get an idea if I made the armature the right size or just wasted everyone's time. You can add larger slabs of clay, but again, this is a smaller character, so I'm just going to build things up a little more carefully. Sometimes sculpting these real simple cartoony characters can be tricky for a few reasons. Mostly because of how they're drawn. Like, faces and proportions can vary quite a bit in animated or comic types. Not only that, but also because when things are real simple, errors tend to become a lot more clear and you can wind up chasing your tail trying to get things perfect. Once I have things roughed out, I like to draw a center line down the whole sculpt to keep the symmetry in check, and I'm doing it a little early here so I know the origin is correct because once that chin is roughed out, it'll be a little tougher. I'm not ambidextrous or anything, but when I'm roughing the head out, I like to try and add clay on both sides evenly. I try to do that whenever I can. I'm not even sure how much it helps, but I've always done it that way and it makes sense in my head, so we'll go with that. I'm right-handed, but sometimes even when using tools, I'll force myself to use my left hand, especially on eyes, because it's easier to get the right angle or to match sides that way. I feel like this is already starting to look like Count Chocula. Obviously, because he's a cartoon character, he has this crazy silhouette. And this is really important even if your subject is a real person, like you're doing a realistic portrait of someone that actually exists. You want to make sure you get not just the silhouette, but the overall shape of everything together. Something like that. I'm starting this portrait off by roughing in the mouth. I don't normally do things this way, but since I don't have much space to play with, not only due to the position of his chin, but also because of the depth I'll need in the mouth. You don't always need a deep mouth, but you know, sometimes you do. So I'm roughing it in, and then if I need to, I can adjust things around it. At this point though, it's looking okay and not like I'll have to mess with it too much. Next, I'm making a new center line before I start the face, and I'm just gonna sketch in the hairline real quick to see if this is where I want it to end up. It looks like that should leave me enough room to sculpt the rest of the face, so I'm gonna go ahead and start putting clay on for the hair. Now that the general mass of the head is in place, I can start working on the profile. I only have a few screen grabs I'm looking at for this, and I'm leaning more towards the original 70s version. I like his almost chibi, super deformed body style, but he's got a real weird profile that I'm going to try and interpret. I'm just having some fun with this one, and it's not a real serious sculpt. Nobody hired me to do this, so I'm fine with it if it looks like 2 a.m. Taco Bell. In fact, that'd be a great troll, wouldn't it? I like to sketch things in to make sure I'm on the right track. It just helps me to visualize where things are going. Man, if only that carried over to real life. I would have sketched myself a law degree instead of a useless skill like mud shaping. The angle of the cheeks is pretty important here, especially for a cartoon character because it's one of the only main defining lines you see in the illustrations. The Count Chocula I'm picturing has kind of longer cheeks. When you look at this, the first thing that's probably going through your odd-shaped head is that's an awful mess and you'd be lost if you had to finish it. But when I look at it, I can already see the rest of the features and I like the direction I'm heading, so I'm going to keep adding more, starting with the brow. Now we'll start putting this long nose on. Look, I don't know why his nose is like this. He must really like the smell of chocolate, I guess. Anyway, it's iconic to the character, so I'm gonna keep it long, baby. I think noses are one of the areas that a new sculptor needs to pay the most attention to. Once you really understand the whole area, portraits become a lot easier to figure out. This is another weird thing that makes illustrated characters tricky to sculpt, though. It's like the nose is just drawn on, and if there's not a lot of clear-cut anatomy to support it, it might take a bit of trial and error to get things to look right. I'd recommend sculpting a few realistic noses first that are based in reality, then move on to the style stylized stuff so you can learn the rules and then sort of learn how to break them. Nostrils are another highly nuanced area, and the best advice I can give is to not waste your life and make YouTube. Pay close attention to the expression you're trying to convey, and if the nostrils would be flared or relaxed, usually you can just look in the mirror and make an expression close to the one you're looking for, and if you can keep your fingers out of there for just 1 friggin' second, observe what happens to them when you change expressions. Actually, in all areas, but especially the nose. Now, I'm gonna time-lapse these eyes. There's just too much to explain, and if you're not worried about learning how to sculpt, it gets boring real quick. Also, I have a whole tutorial focused on them which explains everything you need to know about sculpting eyes for folks looking to become a more serious clay toucher. For now, this gives you an idea of how it was done. So these are just roughed in, and this is the area where I'll spend most of the time on the sculpt, especially towards the end, just tweaking them until I get them to look just right. It can eat up a lot of time. Good thing all you've got is time until Mr. Beast drops his next video. On a real person, there's lots of considerations to make, things like little fat pads and the direction the eyes are looking. I'm gonna make them stylized but with a little bit of realism so it's kind of in the middle of cartoony and lifelike. Also, his gaze will be straight ahead, if not maybe even just a little cross-eyed just to add a hint of goofiness. Otherwise, things are pretty straightforward here. Now that all the facial features are in place, I'm gonna do a hard sketch in on the hairline. And this is really like the rug that ties the room together, man. A lot of times I'll sketch this in real early, again, just to make sure I'm headed in the right direction. Once I have that line in, I start laying down some of the hair over it. You want to do this in the direction the hair is styled. Then I can add the ears, which will also help to make sure the hairline is in the right spot. I shape the ear roughly to size in my hand and then figure out where I want it placed. This greatly affects a likeness, so take your time in figuring out the best spot. Then I'll do the same with the other ear, and before I place it, I can hold it up to the first one to make sure they're around the same size. When that's finalized, stick that on and finish the hairline on the other side. Make sure everything lines up and the hairline is about the same distance from each ear. I'm going to carve in a little line here for the part in his hair, and to soften it, I drag the tool across the line instead of lengthwise alongside it. Then I'm going to punch up the front to make it a little more full and break up these forms a little bit. Add some quick eyebrows and a tongue and his front teeth. Then I'll do a quick once over to see if there are any areas I need to focus on before I finish them up. One thing I can't overstate is how important it is to step back and look at your work. You spend so much time focusing on smaller individual areas that it's easy for things to slide out of place. You want to look at the silhouette and symmetry. Everything looks okay to me, so I'm going to put his cape on and sculpt his shirt. For this, I'm just going to lay some clay over his shoulders. I'm not going to sculpt a bunch of intricate wrinkles because I want it to have more of a simple look, and I'm actually going to leave it really messy on the bottom just because I like the way that looks too. Now I'll draw in some lines that I'm going to follow with some rolled clay pieces. You could use an extruder for this if you wanted it real clean, but I want to keep things loose. I'll add some quick pieces for his little cape tie and then smush a ball of clay on for his button. And this is just a placeholder for now. Next, it's time to start building out the hand. I usually start with the palm first and then add each finger. This is a pretty simple hand to sculpt because all the fingers are spread apart, so you can really get your tiny little tool in there to reach and clean up all the sides. Again, I'm not going super detailed on this. I just want to put in the most important landmarks and masses. The best part about hands is that you can look at your own while sculpting them. It's like built-in reference. And if there's an angle you can't see, mirrors can be useful for more than just wishing away your back fat. I would suggest spending a lot of time examining your own hands. Not only will this give you a deeper understanding of the complexities of the hands, it'll also freak out your loved ones. I try to do it when I'm in line at Starbucks. Now we can put some wrinkles in the palm. I just scribe these in and then soften them again by going across the lines. These lines are called palmar flexion creases, and they're developed before birth. The main lines usually form an M that always reminded me of the Majin Vegeta symbol. Anyway, once they're in, you can soften them further with a brush. Next, we'll put some fingernails on these hands, and for claw-like fingernails, I like to carve in a rough fingernail shape and then add some clay on top to create more of a claw/fingernail hybrid. I want these to be long and sharp so they're less like human nails and more like a bat's claws. It's just a nice touch that gives that non-human look. I've seen lots of girls with fingernails like this. Stay away from them. Count Chocula has a pretty tight-fitting suit, so for the sleeve, I'm just going to draw in a line and add a thin layer of clay over the forearm. Then we'll place this little dust ruffle. Actually, I think this thing's called a ruff, and it's from the Elizabethan era, so it's a cuff ruff. And that's unfortunate. Anyway, to sculpt it, I'm just making some wavy gravy bacon type pieces and sticking them on. I'll blend each piece together with my large tool, but you can use your small one and then give it a quick lazy brush down. I've decided to add a bit more detail onto the shirt, so I'm gonna scrap that placeholder button, and this part is called a placket, which is another stupid name. but let's not focus on that. Instead, let's add some quick ends to Count Chocula's bow tie thingy and make another button. Now, the part that I've been dreading the most of this whole project, his cowl. I thought this was going to suck worse than it did because wet clay just wants to droop and dry out real fast when it's thin, but I decided to just stick most of it to the back of his head, which helped eliminate the need to support it. This might be a problem if I planned on molding, but I don't, so we'll be good. And all I'm doing is just adding it on piece by piece and blending it together with the tool. It's actually a little thicker than it looks towards the neck and then gets thinner as it fans out, which also helps to stop it from drooping. I'll make the edges real thin, which will give it the illusion that it's a really thin piece of clothing, and I'm just going to pinch off around the edges to give it a more rough look. This almost reminds me of bat wings too, so that works out. I wasn't sure if I was going to put any more anatomy in the ears, but I decided that it would look better if I did, so here's another time lapse of some toned down ear anatomy. Now I'm going to do a bit more cleanup on the head and hair, and for that I'll use a sponge that has a smooth side and a reticulated side, basically just like sandpaper. I dip this in a little bit of water and smooth things down, starting with the rough side. It's really easy to overdo things with this and obliterate certain details you might want to keep, but it really makes quick work of getting rid of tool marks, blending areas together, and just cleaning everything up. Pushing the stylized look a little further, I'm going to sculpt some detail in the front of the hair and then use the sponge to tone things down again. I do this back and forth until I'm happy with the way it looks. Now I'll do the same thing to clean up most of the unwanted wrinkles on his face, which is making him look a little older than I want. I'll finish that off with a very soft brush to get into any tougher to reach areas and also to clean up the lines left from the sponge. Just like sandpaper, if you skip right to the brush without the sponge, you'll most likely wind up with a wavy surface, and nobody wants that. Next, I'm just going to clean up these eyebrows. I start by smoothing down the clay I've added earlier, and then I'm going to clean up the shapes with a hobby knife and my spatula tool. Then just finish it off with a brush. And a quick little eyelid crease on each eye. And one of the most stressful parts of sculpting to do on camera, putting the irises and pupils in. I'm using a small loop tool to dig the pupils out, and then instead of leaving a circle, I'm going to put a line in to make the eyes a little more demon or animal-like. And then I'm going to carefully outline the iris. Next, I'm going to add some quick tones with my airbrush just to punch things up a little. I normally prefer the look of an unpainted sculpt, that's why I don't paint them often, but that's a discussion for another video. Consider this more of a black and white paint job.